Hello again. My name is Kevin McGovern. I presented one of the previous sessions with you. In today's session, we're looking at two of the chapters from Part 2 of the Code. We're looking at Chapter 4, which is on older persons and others with special needs. And we're looking at Chapter 5, which is on end of life. In that session, we'll be looking at Catholic Health Australia's Advanced Care Plan as one of the resources we have for end-of-life planning and decision-making. When you think about it, there are a lot of different varieties of care which are provided by Catholic hospitals and Catholic aged and community care. In the slide, there's quite a lot of different modalities of care which are identified, ranging from the care of those who are very young through to the care of those who are very old, and many other groups of people who have special needs. Chapter 4 is the chapter that helps us to think about the different modalities of care which are delivered to those various groups of people. Catholic aged care, hospital care, community care, disability care, mental health care, they're all quite different. I certainly can't hope to cover all of the different characteristics of many different organisations in this short presentation. But wherever you work, it's your task, it's your responsibility to work out the particular culture of your organisation. For example, does your organisation speak about patients or residents or care recipients or service recipients or consumers or customers? Sometimes those different terms have slightly different meanings and contribute to a slightly different culture. Does your organisation talk about care or service provision? Many organisations, especially those that are community-based, will emphasise such ideas as empowerment or re-ablement or promoting people's sense of worth and their quality of life. Many aged care services have a palliative approach. Nowadays, it's a very frail population that move into aged care. And so aged care facilities rightly emphasise effective symptom management so as to promote people's quality of life. Aged care facilities, of course, also speak about empowerment and social inclusion and promoting people's self-worth and quality of life. But whatever type of agency you work for, you really need to explore its culture so that you're able to make an appropriate contribution within the culture of that organisation. Let's talk now about end-of-life care and end-of-life decision-making. As I begin this, I should emphasise that what we're talking about here is simply the clinical aspects of care. In the previous session which I presented, session 4, we spoke then about the human and the spiritual aspects of this care. At this stage, we're talking simply about the clinical aspects. Catholic standards are the traditional standards of Western morality. Those standards make a distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means. Those standards, which are Catholic standards, say that each person has the moral responsibility to use those means of sustaining our life, which are effective, which are not overly burdensome, and which are reasonably available. You'll sometimes see these called either proportionate or ordinary means. On the other hand, this traditional morality says that each person has a moral right to refuse any treatment that is futile, or is overly burdensome, or is morally unacceptable, and these are called extraordinary or disproportionate means. So that's one standard, and it's the standard that we follow within Catholic organisations. There is another standard, it's the standard of modern secular morality. It's often the legal standard. And this standard says that every competent person has an unlimited right to refuse all forms of medical treatment. Obviously, those two standards are in something of a tension. They coexist in healthcare, and one of our tasks in providing healthcare to people is to navigate those two standards. Many health professionals have internalised the standard that says we're required to use ordinary means, but that we're not required to use extraordinary means. And as a result, they will experience a certain amount of moral distress if they're asked to do less than what they think is appropriate, or if they're asked to do more than what is appropriate. Finding our way of navigating those difficult challenges is something we learn as we work our way through clinical practice. Let's look a little bit more closely at the Catholic standard and understand something of what it says. We're talking about extraordinary means, and something can be extraordinary in two ways. First of all, it can be extraordinary through being futile. This means that it is reasonably unlikely that the treatment will have any worthwhile outcome. It will not reduce symptoms. It will not extend life. It will not help the patient to remain conscious and to make decisions. It's treatment that really will have no effective outcome. That treatment may, of course, be refused. Treatment may also be refused if it's overly burdensome. And really, treatment can be overly burdensome in many different ways. It can be physically too painful. A third round of chemotherapy after two other difficult treatments is perhaps a good example of treatment that some people at least might judge to be too painful for them. Treatment may also be refused if it's psychologically too distressing. I knew someone once who'd had a lot of treatment over the years, and one of the things she'd worked out for herself was that nasogastric tubes that are put down the throat, was something that really upset her. She was honest and said it wasn't physically painful, but it was distressing to her to have a tube down her throat, and she decided she didn't want to have that treatment anymore. She was able to do so because that was extraordinary treatment for her. Something can also be extraordinary treatment if it's too socially isolating. If, in order to receive the treatment, the person has to leave their own town, leave their family and all their friends. Someone may well choose not to have that and to settle only for what's available in the town where they live. Treatment may also be extraordinary if it's financially too expensive, either for the person themselves or, at least in some circumstances, for the health system as a whole. If something was morally repugnant, that would also be extraordinary treatment. And treatment can also be extraordinary if it's spiritually too distressing. Indigenous people who live in remote communities and who have a great attachment to country, for them it is very important that they live and that they die on country. And to suggest to them that they might go away for treatment with the risk that they might die off country might be so spiritually distressing that this becomes extraordinary treatment that they can refuse. So there are many different ways in which treatment can be extraordinary, and our task is to work with our patients and clients to help them to work out what would be ordinary means which would make sense to them, and what would be extraordinary means which they're entitled to refuse. Let me talk quickly about pain control. Nowadays, it's quite rare that effective pain control is going to significantly shorten life. But if there is a risk of shortening life, as the only way of maintaining effective pain control. The Catholic Church, along with most other organisations, recognises that it is acceptable to use effective pain control, even if it has the possibility of shortening life. Catholic teaching on tube feeding is rather complex, and one of the readings for this session explains that teaching in a bit more detail. Let me just say here that if you are ever involved in a situation which involves tube feeding and you have some concerns about what is being done or what is not being done, please discuss that with your line supervisor so that we can be confident that the right thing is being done and that you feel comfortable with the care which is being delivered. Let's talk now about advanced care planning. One of the slides sets out a number of documents which are available from Catholic Health Australia to assist us in this task of advanced care planning, to help someone ahead of time to make decisions about the sort of treatment that they would like to have and the sort of treatment that they would prefer not to have. The Code of Ethical Standards contains advice about this. There's also an advanced care plan which many people, particularly those in good health, are finding is a good way of recording their wishes for future treatment. In some years previously to that, Catholic Health Australia also produced two other guides, one for people and one for health professionals considering future health care. All those documents can be downloaded for free from the Catholic Health Australia website, and the Advanced Care Plan is actually one of the readings for this session. The Guide for People Considering Their Future Healthcare gives us a number of insights to the Catholic approach to advanced care planning. First of all, our focus is rightly on ongoing communication. It's not just about filling out forms. Whoever does advanced care planning, we're recognising increasingly what matters most of all is the ongoing conversation. The forms capture that discussion, but they do not replace it. The second thing about the Catholic approach is that we much prefer people to think first of all about appointing a substitute decision maker rather than issuing an advance directive, to have someone we trust and to ask them to make decisions for us if we're not able to is often a better way of dealing with a future which is to some extent unknown, by having someone we trust make decisions for us knowing all the circumstances, rather than ahead of time trying to guess what they might be and writing it all down on a piece of paper. Sometimes an advance directive is entirely appropriate, but it's still appropriate, first of all, to think of appointing someone to speak for us if we cannot speak for ourselves. The third thing which is important, obviously, is to guide our substitute decision maker, to give them some sense of what we would want or what we would not want. As I've spoken with people about this over the years, I've found a good question to ask if we're trying to understand what another person wants is to ask them how hard they want us to try to preserve life. Do they want us to do every last thing? Or do they want us to try to do what we can for perhaps 48 hours? And then if we're not obviously moving them towards cure, to move to a palliative approach that will keep them comfortable and spare them from extraordinary treatment which may not in the long run save their life. But in this and various ways, it's important for us to talk to our substitute decision maker, and if we are a substitute decision maker, to talk to the person we're representing, so that when the time comes we do have some sense of what they would want and we feel confident in speaking for them. At the end of this session, once you've done your reading, there are two cases for you to look at. I hope you find them interesting cases because they will be the sort of things people will encounter in clinical practice. From the session on aged care, there's a question about the palliative approach in advanced care planning. And from the end-of-life care chapter, there's a case involving two women who've been dialysis patients for many years. As you look at that second case, you're directed to one of the sections in the code, and it will give you information that will help you in answering that second question. I hope this material is useful for you, particularly if you are involved either in working with vulnerable groups or working with people as they approach the end of life. These are privileged positions for us to work. I hope that our reflections today will help you as you go about your ministry.